In the Kia Channel of the Aegean Sea on the morning of November 21st, 1916, a lifeboat carrying Violet Jessup was being drawn toward the still-turning propellers of HMHS Britannic, and the distance between survival and disaster was rapidly disappearing. The hospital ship was sinking with alarming speed. The evacuation had become increasingly dangerous, and the machinery that had powered the vessel now threatened the people trying to escape it. Yet this was not the first time Violet had watched one of the world's greatest liners vanish beneath the sea. 4 years earlier, she had survived the loss of RMS Titanic. Now she was facing the destruction of Titanic's sister ship, under different conditions, in a different war, and with no guarantee that experience would protect her a second time. Her story is often remembered because the coincidence appears almost impossible, but it is not the story of an immortal woman moving untouched through catastrophe. It is the story of maritime discipline, timing, decisions made by crew members, rescue systems operating under severe pressure, and extraordinary chance. To understand how Violet reached that lifeboat in the Aegean, the record must first return to April 1912, when she was 24 years old and serving as a White Star Line stewardess aboard RMS Titanic during its maiden voyage. Titanic left Southampton on April 10th, then called at Cherbourg and Queenstown before turning west toward New York. Public attention focused on the ship's enormous scale, advanced engineering, elegant interiors, and the prestige surrounding the newest vessel of the Olympic class. For Violet, however, Titanic was not primarily a symbol. It was a workplace governed by schedules, uniforms, seniority, passenger expectations, and an established chain of command. She was one member of a large crew whose labor allowed thousands of people to live, eat, sleep, travel, and move through the ship with the impression that everything around them was effortless. The work of a stewardess required patience and endurance. Violet was responsible for assisting female passengers, answering cabin calls, preparing rooms, carrying requested items, helping those who were unwell, and maintaining order within the areas assigned to her. The hours could be long, and the distinction between service and emergency depended entirely on what instructions arrived from senior crew members. Her uniform represented more than appearance. It identified her place within the ship's working structure and reminded passengers that she was expected to remain composed, available, and respectful regardless of fatigue or uncertainty. The apparent luxury of Titanic rested on a hidden world of repetitive labor. Behind decorated public rooms and carefully arranged cabins were passageways, service areas, staircases, storage spaces, and crew quarters connected by routines that had to function without interruption. Violet knew this system because she had already worked at sea. She had served with the Royal Mail Line and later joined the White Star Line, gaining experience aboard vessels where passenger comfort depended on strict organization. She had also been aboard RMS Olympic when it collided with HMS Hawk in September 1911. Olympic remained afloat and returned for repairs, but the incident had given Violet an early view of how quickly an ordinary voyage could become an emergency. That experience did not make her fearless, and it did not predict what would happen aboard Titanic. It simply meant that she understood a fundamental truth of maritime service. The size and reputation of a ship could never remove the need for discipline when routine broke down. During the early days of Titanic's crossing, routine did not appear to be in danger. Passengers settled into their accommodations. Meals were served. Cabins were maintained. Officers, engineers, wireless operators, stewards, and deck crews carried out their duties while the ship advanced across the North Atlantic. Class divisions shaped nearly every part of life aboard. First-class passengers occupied expansive suites and grand public spaces. Second-class travelers moved through comfortable but less elaborate accommodations. And many third-class passengers were immigrants traveling toward new lives in the United States. Crew members served within these separated worlds, but the safety of everyone aboard ultimately depended on the same bridge, the same machinery, the same navigation, and the same limited number of lifeboats. Violet's position gave her a human view of the ship that official plans and technical reports could never fully capture. She encountered passengers not as numbers, but as people who needed directions, reassurance, practical help, or simple attention. Yet responsible historical storytelling cannot claim to know every conversation she heard or every private reaction she experienced. Her later memoir provides important recollections, while surviving crew records, official inquiries, and maritime scholarship establish the broader sequence of events. Where memory and documentation differ, the evidence must be handled carefully. On April 14th, Titanic entered colder waters. Wireless operators had received reports of ice from other ships, though later inquiries would examine how those messages were handled and how fully their importance reached the bridge. For most passengers, the ship still seemed stable and secure. Its lights remained bright, its engines continued their rhythm, and daily life followed familiar patterns. This appearance of normality mattered because large ships created a powerful sense of permanence. People could walk through warm corridors while the ocean outside remained dark, cold, and largely invisible. They could hear music, conversation, or the quiet movements of the crew without understanding the conditions beyond the hull. Violet continued her duties inside that protected world. When Titanic made contact with an iceberg late that night, the immediate meaning of the event was not obvious to everyone aboard. The ship did not instantly become a scene of visible chaos. Some passengers felt a vibration or noticed that the engines had changed. Others received information slowly as officers and crew members assessed the situation. The transition from voyage to evacuation unfolded through orders, inspections, and the growing recognition that the ship could not remain afloat. This delay between cause and understanding would become one of the most important elements of the disaster. Rescue depended not only on lifeboats, but on whether people believed they were necessary, whether instructions were communicated clearly, whether boats were prepared correctly, and whether passengers reached the boat deck in time. For Violet, the emergency transformed her ordinary responsibilities. A stewardess who had spent the voyage serving passengers was now part of the effort to guide them through unfamiliar corridors and toward uncertain safety. Her training did not reveal the future, but it gave her a role when confusion threatened to spread. She was expected to follow instructions, assist passengers, and remain useful within a system operating under pressure. Somewhere ahead of her lay Lifeboat 16 and rescue by RMS Carpathia, but those outcomes were not yet guaranteed. Nor could she have imagined that the habits tested during this night would return 4 years later aboard another ship of the same class. The first disaster had begun, but the full pattern of Violet Jessup's survival had not yet revealed itself. To understand why Violet Jessup remained remarkably composed when responsibility fell upon her during moments of uncertainty, it is necessary to look long before the North Atlantic voyage that changed maritime history. She was born on October 2nd, 1887, in Argentina to Irish immigrant parents who had built their lives far from their homeland in search of opportunity. The Jessup family belonged to a community that relied on determination, physical labor, and mutual support rather than privilege. Violet grew up surrounded by brothers and sisters in a household where every family member contributed in some way to daily life. According to Violet's memoir and supported by later biographical research, she experienced a serious childhood illness that kept her from the ordinary routine expected of many children. Modern historians generally identify that illness as tuberculosis, although contemporary medical records are limited. What the available evidence establishes with confidence is that she eventually recovered and continued into adulthood. Her recovery should not be interpreted as evidence of extraordinary destiny or supernatural protection. Childhood illness was unfortunately common during the late 19th century, and Violet's later life should be understood through documented history rather than hindsight. Another major change came with the death of her father, a loss that placed significant financial pressure on the family. Seeking stability, Catherine Jessup relocated her children from Argentina to England, where employment opportunities for Irish immigrant families were more accessible through established community connections. Catherine found work as a shipboard stewardess, entering one of the few respectable occupations available to women that also offered regular wages. Her work required long periods away from home aboard passenger liners, leaving Violet to assume increasing responsibility for helping care for her younger siblings. These family responsibilities developed habits of organization, patience, and reliability, but they should not be exaggerated into predictions of future heroism. They simply reflected the practical realities faced by many working families during that period. England at the beginning of the 20th century offered women relatively limited professional opportunities. Domestic service remained one of the largest employers, while factory work, textile production, teaching, nursing, and clerical positions employed others, depending upon education and social class. Maritime passenger service occupied a unique place among these professions. It demanded discipline comparable to domestic service, while offering wages that could exceed many land-based occupations. Around the age of 21, Violet chose to follow the same profession as her mother by entering maritime service. Later recollections suggest that shipping companies often preferred stewardesses who appeared older because maturity inspired greater confidence among passengers, and Violet herself later recalled taking care to present a more mature appearance during the hiring process. Whether every detail of those memories can be independently verified, the broader historical context supports the reality that appearance, conduct, and professionalism strongly influenced hiring decisions for women aboard passenger liners. Becoming an ocean liner stewardess meant accepting an occupation that was physically exhausting, emotionally demanding, and governed by strict rules. A normal day could begin before sunrise and continue late into the evening with only brief opportunities for rest. Stewardesses cleaned cabins, prepared beds, organized passengers' personal belongings when requested, delivered meals or refreshments, cared for women traveling alone, assisted mothers with children, comforted passengers suffering from seasickness, responded to call bells, and maintained cleanliness throughout assigned sections of the ship. Every task was expected to be completed with courtesy regardless of fatigue. Their uniforms represented professionalism rather than fashion, emphasizing modesty, cleanliness, and easy identification by passengers seeking assistance. Behind the elegance displayed in brochures advertising luxurious Atlantic crossings stood hundreds of crew members whose labor made that comfort possible. Passenger liners also reflected the rigid social structure of the era. First-class accommodations featured spacious suites, elegant dining rooms, libraries, smoking rooms, lounges, and grand staircases. Second-class passengers enjoyed comfortable surroundings intended for professionals, teachers, clergy, and middle-class families. Third-class accommodations, although considered advanced compared with many competing lines, primarily served immigrants traveling toward new opportunities overseas. Stewardesses worked within these divisions, often remaining assigned to particular sections while adapting their service to passengers with very different expectations and needs. Their responsibility extended beyond hospitality. They represented order aboard vessels carrying thousands of people across unpredictable oceans. Violet's first significant maritime employment came with the Royal Mail Line, one of Britain's leading passenger shipping companies. There she learned the practical realities of shipboard life through repeated Atlantic voyages rather than isolated dramatic events. She became familiar with crew hierarchies, emergency routines, passenger expectations, and a constant balance between efficiency and courtesy required. Aboard commercial liners, maritime service rewarded consistency rather than spectacle. The vast majority of voyages ended uneventfully, reinforcing the belief that disciplined routine remained the foundation of safe operations. Violet's growing experience eventually brought her to the White Star Line, whose expanding fleet represented some of the most ambitious engineering achievements of the era. Assignment to White Star vessels placed her within one of the world's most prestigious passenger services, where expectations for professionalism were equally high. Before Titanic ever entered service, Violet worked aboard RMS Olympic, the first completed ship of the Olympic class. Olympic impressed passengers through unprecedented size, elegant interiors, advanced engineering, and the confidence that surrounded modern shipbuilding. Yet for crew members, daily life remained grounded in familiar responsibilities. Cabins still required preparation. Passengers still required assistance. Uniforms still had to remain immaculate, and orders still flowed through a strict chain of command. On September 20th, 1911, Olympic collided with HMS Hawke near the Isle of Wight. Official investigations later examined navigational circumstances surrounding the collision, while historians have continued evaluating the contributing factors. What remains firmly established is that Olympic sustained serious damage but remained afloat, allowing the ship to return under its own power for repairs. For Violet, this became her first close encounter with a major maritime emergency. The incident demonstrated that even the newest and most celebrated ocean liners could unexpectedly shift from routine operation into organized crisis management. Crew discipline became immediately important as officers assessed the situation and passengers awaited reliable information. There is no historical basis for claiming that Violet believed this experience foreshadowed future disasters, nor should the collision be portrayed as a mysterious warning. Instead, it provided practical experience that reinforced the value of calm procedures during unexpected events. Olympic eventually returned to service after repairs, and maritime life resumed its ordinary rhythm. Passengers continued booking crossings. White Star continued expanding its reputation, and Violet continued performing the demanding work expected of every stewardess. Less than 7 months later, another assignment would place her aboard a newly completed Olympic-class liner preparing for its first Atlantic crossing. Nothing in the surviving historical record suggests that she viewed this assignment as unusually dangerous. From a perspective of a working stewardess, it represented another professional opportunity aboard one of the most celebrated passenger ships ever constructed. Only later would history connect Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic into a single extraordinary narrative surrounding one woman's career at sea. On the morning of April 10th, 1912, RMS Titanic departed Southampton to begin the voyage that had attracted worldwide attention long before the ship ever reached the open Atlantic. Crowds gathered along the waterfront to watch the newest vessel of the White Star Line leave her berth, while passengers, crew members, harbor workers, and company officials each viewed the departure from different perspectives. For many travelers, the crossing promised comfort, speed, and prestige. For Violet Jessup, now 24 years old and serving as a first-class stewardess, it marked the beginning of another demanding assignment in a profession where routine mattered far more than public excitement. Titanic represented the latest achievement of the Olympic class, but for the hundreds of crew members aboard, every successful voyage still depended on countless ordinary tasks completed correctly every day. After leaving Southampton, Titanic crossed the English Channel to Cherbourg, where additional passengers boarded by tender because the harbor could not accommodate a ship of such size. The following day, the vessel called at Queenstown, now known as Cove, on the southern coast of Ireland. There, mail was loaded, more passengers came aboard, and many immigrants looked toward America with hopes of beginning entirely new lives. Once Titanic departed Queenstown and entered the open Atlantic, there would be no further scheduled stops before New York. The voyage settled into its normal rhythm, and the enormous vessel became a floating community where thousands of people lived according to carefully organized routines. Violet's responsibilities centered on first-class accommodations, an area designed to reflect the highest standards of luxury available in commercial ocean travel. The passengers occupying these cabins expected attentive service throughout every hour of the day. Stewardesses prepared rooms, made beds, arranged clothing when requested, answered cabin bells, assisted women traveling alone, cared for children when appropriate, delivered messages, responded to illnesses that commonly accompanied long sea voyages, and ensured that passengers found comfort in surroundings carefully maintained by an invisible workforce. Every assignment required professionalism, discretion, and patience regardless of how long the working day became. While first-class passengers enjoyed elegant dining rooms, richly decorated lounges, libraries, cafes, reception rooms, and the famous grand staircase, Another world existed beyond public view. Beneath the polished wood, decorative plasterwork, and electric lighting operated an intricate network of crew corridors, service staircases, storage rooms, laundries, kitchens, engineering spaces, and crew accommodations. Hundreds of employees moved continuously through these hidden areas so that passengers rarely noticed the labor supporting their experience. Violet crossed between these two worlds every day. She understood the refined atmosphere expected above deck, while spending much of her working time in the practical environment where crew members coordinated supplies, received instructions, and prepared for the next series of passenger requests. The contrast between visible luxury and unseen responsibility defined life aboard nearly every great passenger liner of the era. But nowhere was that contrast more striking than aboard Titanic. Overall command rested with Captain Edward Smith, one of the most respected senior captains employed by the White Star Line. His long career and experience contributed significantly to public confidence in the voyage. Also aboard was Thomas Andrews, the principal representative of Harland and Wolff and one of the ship's designers, who traveled to observe the vessel's performance during its maiden crossing and to note any improvements that might benefit future operations. Their responsibilities differed greatly from Violet's daily work, yet together they represented different levels of the organizational structure that governed the ship. Officers directed navigation, engineers maintained propulsion and machinery, wireless operators handled communications, stewards and stewardesses cared for passengers, and every department relied upon coordination with the others. As the voyage progressed westward across the North Atlantic, wireless operators continued receiving messages from nearby ships. Among these communications were reports describing sea ice and icebergs along portions of the intended route. The historical record shows that multiple warnings arrived during the crossing, although later official inquiries examined how those reports were handled, distributed, and prioritized. Violet would not have possessed the technical knowledge or operational authority to evaluate navigational decisions being made on the bridge. Like most members of the stewarding staff, her responsibility remained focused on passenger care rather than ship navigation. It would therefore be inaccurate to suggest that she understood the broader strategic situation developing beyond her assigned duties. For crew members working outside the bridge and engineering departments, daily responsibilities continued much as before. Meals were served according to schedule, cabins remained occupied, passengers socialized throughout the public rooms, and the outward appearance of the voyage reflected confidence rather than concern. By Sunday evening, April 14th, the atmosphere aboard Titanic remained remarkably calm. The sea itself appeared unusually smooth, and many later observers noted the absence of significant waves. Inside the ship, music, conversation, and ordinary passenger activities continued. Few people had reason to believe that the voyage was approaching its defining moment. Shortly before midnight, at approximately 11:40 p.m., Titanic struck an iceberg. Contemporary accounts describe the contact as noticeable but not universally alarming. Some passengers reported feeling only a slight vibration or gentle shudder, while others barely recognized that anything unusual had occurred. Because the ship remained upright and many onboard systems continued functioning immediately afterward, there was no instant visual confirmation that a critical emergency had begun. This initial uncertainty became one of the defining characteristics of the disaster's earliest minutes. Passengers naturally looked toward the crew for guidance because they possessed little information about what had actually happened. Crew members likewise awaited instructions from senior officers responsible for assessing the situation. Below deck, officers and engineers began evaluating the condition of the vessel. Thomas Andrews participated in examining the damage alongside senior personnel. The available historical evidence indicates that the assessment reached a deeply troubling conclusion. The ship could not remain afloat indefinitely. That realization did not become public knowledge all at once. Instead, information moved through the chain of command before orders gradually reached different departments throughout the vessel. Violet remained within the stewarding organization and therefore received instructions appropriate to her responsibilities rather than detailed technical explanations regarding the ship's condition. Her role was not to interpret structural damage or engineering reports. Her responsibility was to assist passengers according to the directions provided by her superiors. As those instructions evolved, the routine duties of hospitality gave way to emergency service. Stewardesses who had spent previous days preparing cabins and answering ordinary requests now helped guide passengers, encourage calm behavior, and assisted women as preparations for evacuation slowly began. The change was profound, but not chaotic in its earliest stages. The crew's objective remained to preserve order while officers determined the safest course of action. Many passengers still believed the interruption might prove temporary because the full seriousness of the situation had not yet become obvious from their immediate surroundings. Violet could only act upon the information available to her at that moment. She had no knowledge of how history would remember the voyage, no certainty regarding the outcome, and no reason to believe that another Olympic-class ship would eventually place her in another extraordinary emergency years later. The available evidence suggests only that she fulfilled the responsibilities expected of a White Star Line stewardess as the situation steadily changed. Then came another instruction that clearly marked the transition from ordinary service to survival. Violet either put on, or was directed to put on, a life belt and proceed toward the boat deck, where the next stage of the unfolding evacuation was about to begin. On Titanic's boat deck, the crew became the bridge between confidence and uncertainty. During the early hours of April 15, 1912, as the seriousness of the situation became unmistakable, Violet Jessup and the other stewardesses were directed toward the boat deck, where their responsibilities shifted completely from ordinary passenger service to assisting in organized evacuation. The polished routines that had governed every previous day of the voyage no longer centered on meals, cabins, or schedules. Instead, every instruction focused on helping passengers reach the lifeboats in an orderly manner while officers and sailors worked against time. Violet wore a life belt as instructed, joining countless others whose appearance had suddenly become transformed by bulky cork-filled preservers covering the formal clothing that only hours earlier had reflected the elegance of a transatlantic crossing. The contrast between the luxury of Titanic's public rooms and the practical reality unfolding on the open decks could hardly have been greater. Electric lights still illuminated much of the ship, but attention had shifted entirely toward the rows of lifeboats suspended above the sea. Officers supervised loading procedures while sailors prepared the falls and lowering equipment. Stewardesses and stewards guided passengers wherever they could provide useful assistance, helping women and children find the correct locations while trying to reduce confusion rather than increase it. Historical accounts consistently describe that communication itself became an important challenge. Titanic carried passengers representing numerous nationalities, and not everyone aboard understood English well enough to immediately interpret shouted instructions or official announcements. Some families hesitated because they struggled to understand what was happening, while others remained reluctant to leave the apparent safety of the large, brightly lit ship for comparatively small wooden boats suspended above the dark Atlantic. Crew members therefore relied not only on authority, but also on gestures, repetition, and patient guidance to encourage movement toward the lifeboats. Violet's responsibilities remained consistent with her position as a first-class stewardess. She assisted where directed, following orders rather than making independent operational decisions. The surviving evidence does not support placing her at the center of command, nor does it suggest she possessed technical knowledge about the ship's structural condition beyond what was communicated through the chain of command. Her contribution belonged to the disciplined response expected from trained crew members performing their assigned duties during an emergency. As the evacuation continued, the number of available lifeboats steadily decreased. Some departed with empty seats because uncertainty during the earliest stages caused hesitation among passengers, while later boats faced increasing urgency as the reality of the situation became more widely understood. Eventually, Violet herself was instructed to enter Lifeboat 16. That moment became the turning point, separating participation in the evacuation from becoming one of the people whose survival would depend upon the small craft already moving away from the ship. According to Violet Jessup's later memoir, shortly before or during the loading of Lifeboat 16, an officer placed an infant into her arms with instructions to care for the child. This episode has become one of the most frequently repeated details associated with her experience. At the same time, responsible historical interpretation requires careful qualification. The available independent records have not established the identity of the infant with certainty, and historians have proposed different possibilities without reaching definitive agreement. Consequently, the anecdote is most accurately presented as something Jessup later recalled rather than as an independently verified fact in every detail. Her memoir remains an important first-hand source, but like all personal recollections written after extraordinary events, it is best understood alongside surviving crew records, official inquiries, and broader historical scholarship. Lifeboat 16 was lowered successfully from the ship, descending gradually toward the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The operation demanded careful coordination because the boat had to remain balanced, while crew members controlled its descent using ropes and mechanical equipment. Once afloat, the occupants pulled away from Titanic in accordance with established practice. Distance served an important purpose. Remaining too close to a large vessel during an emergency could expose a lifeboat to additional hazards. So moving away from the ship became part of the survival strategy, followed by many of the boats that launched successfully. From the water, those aboard the lifeboats observed the immense liner from an entirely different perspective. The vessel that had appeared almost permanent only hours before now revealed unmistakable signs that the situation was beyond recovery. Official investigations and the testimony of survivors established that Titanic sank at approximately 2:20 in the morning on April 15, 1912. Rather than describing the event through sensational images, it is more accurate to recognize it as the final stage of a carefully documented maritime disaster whose consequences would shape international safety regulations for generations. For the people inside the lifeboats, the sinking did not immediately end their ordeal. They remained on the open ocean for hours, surrounded by darkness, cold air, and uncertainty about when help might arrive. The conditions aboard every lifeboat differed according to location, occupancy, leadership, and available supplies. Some boats remained closer together, while others drifted farther apart. Everyone aboard depended upon rescue from another vessel, because the lifeboats themselves had only limited capacity to sustain survivors over an extended period. Fortunately, the passenger liner RMS Carpathia had received Titanic's wireless distress calls and altered course at full speed to assist. Carpathia's officers and crew prepared throughout the night for the difficult task of recovering hundreds of survivors from scattered lifeboats under challenging conditions. As daylight gradually approached, the rescue operation began. One by one, lifeboats came alongside Carpathia, and survivors were brought aboard with organized assistance from the ship's crew. Violet reached safety not because of a single dramatic action, but because several documented factors aligned in her favor. She followed the instructions given to her by senior crew members. She reached an available lifeboat before launching opportunities disappeared. Lifeboat 16 successfully cleared Titanic without becoming disabled during the lowering process. Carpathia answered the distress calls, arrived at the scene, and completed the rescue. Alongside these practical explanations remains another factor that no investigation could eliminate: chance. Many capable crew members and passengers acted responsibly, yet experienced very different outcomes because of timing, location, available space, communication, and circumstances beyond individual control. Titanic's survival patterns were unequal, shaped by numerous variables that historians continue to examine through passenger lists, crew records, and official testimony. Violet's survival, therefore, should never be interpreted as evidence that skill alone guaranteed safety. Her professionalism mattered, the crew's organization mattered, The rescue system mattered, but opportunity and timing mattered as well. In the days that followed, Carpathia carried the survivors toward New York, where relief efforts, medical assistance, family reunions, official reporting, and worldwide attention awaited them. Eventually, Violet began the journey back toward England, carrying memories that would remain with her for the rest of her life. She had survived one of history's most famous maritime disasters, yet nothing in the historical record suggests that she immediately regarded herself as extraordinary. More remarkably still, the question that would later define her place in maritime history remained unanswered. After experiencing everything she had witnessed aboard Titanic, why would she ever choose to return to the sea? Carpathia's rescue ended the immediate crisis, but it did not end Violet Jessup's story. After the survivors reached safety aboard RMS Carpathia and the ship arrived in New York, attention quickly shifted from the rescue itself to understanding how one of the most celebrated passenger liners in the world had been lost during its maiden voyage. Newspapers across Europe and North America devoted extensive coverage to the disaster, while governments, shipping companies, engineers, and the public demanded answers. Violet Jessup returned to Britain carrying the experience of a crew member who had witnessed the event from within the organized structure of the White Star Line, rather than from the perspective of investigators or senior officers. Like many survivors, she resumed ordinary life while the wider world attempted to reconstruct an extraordinary sequence of events. Official inquiries soon began on both sides of the Atlantic. In the United States, a Senate investigation gathered testimony from survivors, officers, and maritime experts. In Britain, the Wreck Commissioner's inquiry examined technical evidence, operational procedures, wireless communications, lifeboat regulations, navigation, and numerous other aspects of the disaster. These investigations established much of the historical foundation that continues to shape scholarly understanding today. They also revealed an important distinction between personal recollection and documentary evidence. Individual survivors could accurately describe what they personally experienced, but no single witness possessed complete knowledge of everything that occurred throughout. The ship. Violet's later memoir, therefore, occupies an important but carefully defined place within the historical record. Her recollections provide valuable observations from the viewpoint of a stewardess carrying out assigned duties, yet they cannot independently establish every technical or operational detail surrounding the disaster. Responsible historical scholarship compares her account with official inquiries, surviving crew records, passenger testimony, and other contemporary evidence before reaching broader conclusions. This careful approach does not diminish the value of her memoir. Instead, it recognizes that every first-hand witness experienced only one part of a far larger event. Violet herself rarely became a public spokesperson immediately after the sinking. The available evidence suggests that she generally returned to professional life rather than seeking public attention. Later in life, through her memoir, she described aspects of the experience and reflected upon events aboard Titanic. But historians remain cautious about assigning emotions or private struggles beyond what her own writings and documented testimony support. It would therefore be inaccurate to invent recurring nightmares, prolonged survivor guilt, dramatic private conversations, or other deeply personal experiences that cannot be established from reliable sources. What can be documented is considerably more revealing in its own way. Within only a matter of weeks after surviving Titanic, Violet made the remarkable decision to return to sea. Modern audiences often assume that anyone surviving such an event would permanently abandon maritime employment. Yet the economic and professional realities of the early 20th century were very different. Ocean travel remained her profession, and opportunities for experienced stewardesses were neither abundant nor easily replaced. Returning to work represented continuity rather than extraordinary fearlessness. It also reflected confidence in the profession itself rather than blind confidence that disasters could never happen again. Violet resumed service aboard RMS Olympic after the ship returned to operation following modifications and repairs. The decision carried symbolic weight because Olympic belonged to the same class of vessel as Titanic. But contemporary evidence does not indicate that Violet treated the assignment as an act of personal defiance or dramatic courage. She returned because it was her occupation. The maritime industry itself also changed profoundly after Titanic. Investigations exposed weaknesses in existing safety regulations, especially concerning lifeboat capacity, emergency procedures, wireless communications, and continuous radio watch requirements. International cooperation eventually produced new standards intended to reduce the likelihood that similar failures would be repeated. Shipping companies re-evaluated evacuation drills, emergency equipment, and operational procedures. Designers reconsidered compartment arrangements, while maritime authorities recognized that technological achievement alone could never replace careful preparation for emergencies. These reforms influenced not only White Star Line operations, but passenger shipping throughout the world. Even the unfinished third Olympic-class liner reflected this changing environment. Originally designed as another luxury passenger ship, Britannic underwent significant modifications during construction as lessons from Titanic became available. Additional watertight features, changes to bulkheads, improvements intended to enhance survivability, and revised arrangements for lifeboats formed part of the evolving design. Before Britannic could begin civilian passenger service, however, history intervened in an entirely different way. In August 1914, Europe entered the First World War. Commercial shipping companies suddenly found themselves supporting wartime logistics on an unprecedented scale. Passenger liners transported troops, supplies, and medical personnel, while many civilian vessels were requisitioned for military purposes. Britannic never entered the transatlantic passenger career originally envisioned by her builders. Instead, she was converted into a hospital ship serving the British war effort. Her exterior changed dramatically. The familiar commercial appearance of a White Star Liner gave way to an internationally recognized medical configuration. Her hull and superstructure were painted white, broad green bands extended along her sides, and large red crosses identified her humanitarian function under the conventions governing hospital ships. Internally, luxurious passenger accommodations were transformed into hospital wards, treatment areas, operating facilities, and spaces designed to receive wounded military personnel evacuated from campaigns in the eastern Mediterranean. The conversion represented one of the most striking transformations ever applied to an Olympic-class liner. Violet once again found herself adapting her professional skills to changing circumstances. During the war, she served aboard Britannic in work commonly described by reputable historical accounts as nursing or medical support service. Although she was not a formally trained physician, her responsibilities supported the care of patients aboard a vessel specifically organized for medical evacuation. The discipline required remained familiar. Organization, cleanliness, careful attention to instructions, and cooperation among departments continued to define daily life, even though the mission had changed from transporting paying passengers to assisting military casualties. The atmosphere aboard Britannic differed greatly from the luxury associated with Titanic. Yet the ship still depended upon coordination among officers, engineers, medical personnel, and support staff working within a carefully structured hierarchy. Command of Britannic during her final voyage rested with Captain Charles Alfred Bartlett, an experienced White Star Line master respected for his professional judgment and extensive maritime background. Bartlett understood the ship's systems, her operating characteristics, and the responsibilities associated with commanding one of the largest vessels afloat. Historical accounts consistently portray him as a capable and cautious commander who approached navigation with professionalism rather than complacency. At the same time, there is no evidence that he possessed advanced knowledge of the disaster that would later unfold. Like every experienced captain, he relied upon available information, established procedures, and the circumstances confronting him during each voyage. Neither his experience nor Britannic's improvements could eliminate every possible danger created by war at sea. By November 1916, Britannic had already completed several successful hospital ship missions. Her crews had become accustomed to long voyages between Britain and the Eastern Mediterranean, transporting medical personnel and recovering wounded soldiers requiring treatment away from the front. The ship's routine reflected efficiency, discipline, and confidence developed through repeated operations. On her next assignment, Britannic again departed for the Eastern Mediterranean under Captain Bartlett's command, carrying crew members, medical staff, and the expectation that another voyage would follow the same orderly pattern established before. Among those aboard was Violet Jessup, returning once again to the sea that had already tested her more than once. Unaware that the carefully prepared hospital ship was now beginning the final voyage for which history would remember her most. Britannic's routines resembled those of any successful voyage until one ordinary morning suddenly became part of maritime history. By November 1916, HMHS Britannic had already completed several hospital ship missions through the Mediterranean, transporting medical personnel and evacuating wounded servicemen from the Eastern Theater of the First World War. Although she had been designed as the third great Olympic-class passenger liner, the demands of war had transformed nearly every aspect of her purpose. Her gleaming white hull, broad green bands, and prominent red crosses signaled her protected role under international conventions, while inside, luxurious passenger accommodations had been converted into wards, treatment areas, operating rooms, and spaces dedicated to medical care. For those serving aboard, however, daily life still depended on routine. Each morning began with familiar responsibilities carried out according to schedules refined over previous voyages. Violet Jessup had become accustomed to this rhythm. Her duties, commonly described in reliable historical accounts as nursing or medical support work, required organization, attention to detail, cleanliness, and steady cooperation with the ship's medical staff. Unlike her earlier service aboard passenger liners, her work now centered upon supporting patients and maintaining the orderly operation of a floating hospital rather than attending to commercial travelers. Yet many habits remained familiar. Discipline still governed every department. Instructions flowed through an established chain of command. The smooth functioning of the vessel depended upon hundreds of individuals performing ordinary tasks with consistency rather than dramatic heroics. Above them, Captain Charles Alfred Bartlett commanded the ship from the bridge. Bartlett brought years of maritime experience with the White Star Line and understood Britannic's systems thoroughly. Historical records consistently describe him as a careful and capable master who relied upon established navigational practice and disciplined command. On the morning of November 21st, 1916, Britannic was proceeding through the Aegean Sea toward the Kia Channel, continuing another voyage that had given no obvious indication of the extraordinary events soon to unfold. Weather conditions were favorable, visibility remained good, and routine activity continued throughout much of the ship. Crew members performed their assigned work while patients, medical personnel, engineers, officers, and support staff followed the familiar pattern established during earlier crossings. From Violet's perspective below and within the working areas of the ship, nothing immediately distinguished that morning from others she had experienced aboard Britannic. She could not observe the navigation of the vessel, evaluate military risks in surrounding waters, or anticipate developments on bridge. Like nearly everyone outside the command staff, her understanding of events depended upon information reaching her through official instructions. Then, at approximately 8:12 in the morning, the routine ended. A powerful but muffled explosion was felt throughout the ship. Contemporary witnesses described the sensation differently depending upon their location, but a sudden disturbance quickly replaced the predictable rhythm of ordinary service. From Violet's immediate perspective, the important reality was simple. Something serious had happened. She did not possess technical information explaining its cause, nor could she immediately determine the extent of the damage. Her responsibilities shifted from routine duties toward emergency response as officers and senior personnel began issuing new instructions. On the bridge, Captain Bartlett confronted a rapidly developing crisis requiring immediate decisions. Official records from the period refer to the possibility that Britannic had struck either an enemy torpedo or a mine. Later historical research, supported by evidence gathered after the war, strongly favors the conclusion that the ship encountered a German-laid naval mine placed in the channel during earlier military operations. While alternative explanations occasionally appeared in later speculation, the available historical evidence does not support claims of sabotage or unverified secondary explosions as established fact. Responsible reconstruction, therefore, follows the strongest documentary evidence, while acknowledging the language contained in contemporary records. Whatever the precise mechanism appeared to those aboard at that instant, the practical consequences became increasingly clear. Water entered damaged compartments, and the ship began to develop a list toward starboard. Orders were issued to close the watertight doors in accordance with established emergency procedures. These doors represented one of the significant safety improvements associated with the Olympic-class design and reflected lessons reinforced after the loss of Titanic. Their purpose was straightforward: isolate damaged sections of the vessel and slow the spread of flooding. From the bridge, officers relied upon these systems while attempting to evaluate how extensively the ship had been compromised. Wireless operators also began transmitting distress messages requesting assistance, continuing another lesson that had become deeply embedded within maritime practice after 1912. Communication now formed an essential element of survival. Strategy, ensuring that nearby vessels and naval authorities could respond as rapidly as circumstances allowed. Captain Bartlett also made another critical decision based upon his immediate assessment of the situation. Rather than preparing only for abandonment at sea, he attempted to bring Britannic toward the nearby island of Kea in the hope of grounding the vessel in shallow water before flooding became uncontrollable. If successful, such a maneuver might preserve the ship long enough to complete an orderly evacuation or even prevent her complete loss. This decision reflected practical seamanship rather than certainty. It represented an effort to use the ship's remaining mobility while propulsion remained available. Modern historical analysis has benefited from engineering studies, official inquiries, and later examinations unavailable to those making decisions aboard Britannic that morning. These sources indicate that although the watertight systems functioned as designed in many respects, flooding spread more rapidly than anticipated. Investigations concluded that several damaged compartments emitted large amounts of water, producing an increasingly severe starboard list. Historians also note that some lower portholes have been opened for ventilation in hospital wards, a reasonable practice during normal operation in favorable weather. As the list increased, those openings gradually approached and then reached the waterline, allowing additional seawater to enter portions of the ship not originally compromised by the explosion itself. Combined with the extent of the initial damage and the continued forward movement resulting from Captain Bartlett's attempt to reach shallow water, these factors contributed significantly to the speed with which Britannic's condition deteriorated. None of these engineering conclusions, however, would have been fully understood by Violet Jessop during the emergency itself. Her experience remained immediate, practical, and incomplete. She could feel changes in the vessel's movement and see crew members adjusting their footing as the list increased. Around her, the pace of work was becoming more urgent. She could respond to instructions appropriate to her responsibilities. She could not see internal damage spreading through multiple compartments, evaluate structural calculations, or know how later investigations would reconstruct the technical sequence leading toward the ship's loss. The contrast between these perspectives is essential to understanding the historical event. On the bridge, officers assembled information from instruments, reports, and direct observation while making decisions affecting the entire ship. Throughout the rest of Britannic, individual crew members experienced only fragments of a larger picture. As the list continued increasing, the possibility that the ship might be saved steadily diminished. Preparations for evacuation accelerated. Lifeboats became the focus of activity as officers, sailors, medical staff, and support personnel worked to move people safely away from the increasingly unstable vessel. Yet another dangerous complication remained. Because Captain Bartlett continued attempting to beach Britannic while propulsion was still available, the great propellers at the stern remained in motion. Their continued rotation made precise timing essential during the evacuation. Officers needed to balance the urgency of launching lifeboats against the hazards created by machinery that had not yet come to a complete stop. Violet followed the instructions available to her, just as she had 4 years earlier aboard another Olympic-class ship, but the circumstances were now developing in a profoundly different way. The evacuation had begun. The list continued to increase. The propellers were still turning, and within the next few moments those separate facts would combine into the most dangerous experience of her entire maritime career. As Britannic continued moving through the waters of the Kia Channel, every passing minute narrowed the margin for a safe evacuation. From Violet Jessup's position among the crew responding to the emergency, there was little opportunity to understand the larger technical situation unfolding beneath the decks. She knew only what could be seen directly around her. The ship had developed a pronounced list to starboard. Crew members continued directing people toward the lifeboats. Orders were being carried out with increasing urgency. Above all, the enormous vessel had not yet come completely to rest. While officers on the bridge continued balancing the possibility of reaching shallow water against the rapidly deteriorating condition of the ship, those preparing the lifeboats faced decisions that would become critical within only a few moments. Historical accounts describe that several lifeboats on Britannic's port side were lowered before the ship's engines had completely stopped and while the great propellers at the stern were still turning. The reasons behind those launches have been examined by historians for many years. Conditions aboard were changing quickly. Communication across a vessel of Britannic size remained challenging during an emergency, and different parts of the ship experienced events at different speeds. Whatever the precise sequence of individual decisions, the historical evidence consistently indicates that some boats entered the water while the ship still possessed forward movement and active propulsion. That combination created a danger fundamentally different from anything experienced during Titanic's evacuation 4 years earlier. Violet found herself aboard one of those lifeboats. At first, the lowering itself followed familiar maritime procedure. The boat descended from the davits toward the sea, while those aboard depended entirely upon the crew handling the lowering gear above. Once the lifeboat reached the water, however, conditions changed rapidly. Instead of drifting steadily away from the ship, the boat became affected by the movement of the still advancing vessel. The enormous propellers, designed to move one of the largest ships in the world, continued rotating beneath the surface, generating powerful currents around the stern. Those aboard the affected lifeboats could not observe every force acting beneath the water, but they could recognize that the boats were no longer moving as expected. The distance separating safety from danger was shrinking rather than increasing. According to Violet Jessup's memoir, she quickly realized that remaining inside the lifeboat might place her in even greater danger. Her recollection presents the decision as an immediate practical response rather than a dramatic act of heroism. Faced with rapidly changing conditions, she left the boat before it reached the area of greatest danger near the propellers. Responsible historical narration should remain faithful to the available evidence. It is neither necessary nor appropriate to exaggerate the event through graphic description. Jessup later recalled entering the water as the surrounding currents became increasingly powerful. She described being pulled beneath the surface and striking her head during the experience. Later in life, she also wrote that medical examination revealed evidence of a skull injury that she believed originated during this incident. While every detail of the underwater sequence cannot be independently reconstructed, reputable historical accounts generally accept that she entered the water, experienced the violent movement created by the sinking ship, survived the immersion, and was subsequently brought to safety. The available historical record does not conclusively identify the individual responsible for rescuing her. Different retellings sometimes attempt to assign a specific rescuer, but reliable documentation does not establish that identity with certainty. The most accurate description is therefore that Violet was eventually assisted from the water and brought aboard another lifeboat, where she survived the remainder of the evacuation. Her survival depended not upon a single miraculous moment, but upon several events occurring in rapid succession. She recognized the danger developing around her lifeboat. She acted before reaching the area of greatest risk. She survived the powerful currents surrounding the ship. She was then recovered by others already engaged in the broader rescue effort. At the same time, events continued unfolding on Britannic herself. Captain Charles Alfred Bartlett remained on the bridge, directing the evacuation for as long as circumstances permitted. Historical accounts consistently describe him as continuing to issue orders while the situation remained salvageable, delaying his own departure until the ship had been almost completely cleared of those still aboard. Only when remaining on the bridge no longer served a practical purpose did he leave his command position. This sequence reflected long-established maritime expectations concerning the responsibilities of a ship's master during an emergency. Bartlett's conduct afterward received considerable respect from many historians because his decisions throughout the evacuation emphasized saving lives under exceptionally difficult conditions. Although Britannic could not be preserved, the organized response by officers, engineers, medical personnel, and crew contributed significantly to the remarkably high survival rate achieved during the disaster. The final moments of the ship unfolded with extraordinary speed compared with Titanic. From the explosion at approximately 8:12 in the morning until the vessel disappeared beneath the surface, only about 55 minutes had passed. The contrast between the two Olympic-class disasters could hardly have been greater. Titanic remained afloat for more than 2.5 hours after striking the iceberg, while Britannic's loss developed in less than 1 hour despite the additional safety improvements incorporated after 1912. Modern engineering analysis explains much of that difference through the nature of the damage, the progressive flooding, the starboard list, the effect of submerged lower portholes, and the operational circumstances of the attempted grounding. Those conclusions belong to later historical reconstruction rather than to the immediate understanding of those aboard. For Violet and the others struggling simply to survive, only the visible reality mattered. The ship continued settling lower into the water until recovery became impossible. Britannic finally disappeared beneath the surface of the Aegean Sea, ending the career of the largest vessel lost during the First World War. Unlike Titanic, however, the overwhelming majority of people aboard survived. The exact number of individuals present varies slightly among historical sources because different records count personnel in different ways, but reputable scholarship consistently reports that approximately 30 people lost their lives during the disaster, while well over 1,000 others survived. The comparatively low loss of life reflected multiple factors working together, including improved lifeboat capacity, organized evacuation procedures, rapid rescue efforts by nearby vessels, and the actions of the crew, despite the severe complications created by the ship's movement and the still-turning propellers. Floating safely once again after the evacuation had ended, Violet Jessup looked back across the water at another Olympic-class ship disappearing beneath the sea. For years earlier, she had watched history change in the North Atlantic. Now she had witnessed a second sister ship vanish beneath the surface in the eastern Mediterranean. The coincidence alone seemed almost beyond belief, yet the deeper explanation for why she survived both disasters still remained incomplete. That answer would emerge only by examining everything that connected the two voyages rather than viewing either one in isolation. When the two disasters are placed side by side, the extraordinary pattern in Violet Jessup's life becomes clearer without needing to turn it into legend. She was aboard RMS Titanic in April 1912 for a straightforward reason. She was a White Star Line stewardess carrying out the profession she had entered as a young woman in England. Titanic was another assignment aboard one of the company's newest vessels, and nothing in the surviving record suggests that Violet boarded expecting danger. Like hundreds of other crew members, She was there because the ship required trained workers capable of serving passengers throughout a transatlantic crossing. When the iceberg collision transformed routine into emergency, Violet remained within the chain of command expected of a stewardess. She assisted passengers as directed, put on a life belt, reported to the boat deck, and entered Lifeboat 16 when ordered. Her survival followed a documented sequence rather than a secret path or a single heroic act. She reached a boat while space remained. The lowering crew brought it safely to the water. The boat cleared Titanic. Wireless operators transmitted distress calls. RMS Carpathia altered course, and its crew recovered the survivors after hours in the North Atlantic. Violet lived because she remained connected to an evacuation and rescue system that, in her case, continued to function under extreme pressure. Yet professional conduct did not guarantee safety. Many passengers and crew members also followed instructions but faced different outcomes because of their location, timing, access to boats, communication, and circumstances beyond their control. Chance cannot be removed from any honest explanation of her survival. That fact also helps explain why Titanic did not end Violet's maritime career. Ocean liner service remained her occupation and source of income at a time when experienced women had limited alternatives. Returning to RMS Olympic was not proof that she had forgotten what happened, nor does the evidence support portraying it as an act of theatrical defiance. She returned because the sea was where she worked. The industry to which she returned, however, was changing. Titanic and Olympic shared the same design lineage, but the unfinished third Olympic-class liner incorporated major safety revisions as lessons from the disaster became available. Britannic received changes to watertight arrangements, bulkheads, and lifeboat provisions intended to improve survivability. Before she could enter the civilian passenger service originally planned for her, the First World War changed her purpose. Britannic became a hospital ship, painted white with broad green bands and large red crosses, and her interiors were converted into wards and medical spaces. Violet joined her because wartime maritime service still required experienced personnel, and reputable historical accounts commonly describe her duties as nursing or medical support work. The connection promised by the story's title was therefore not coincidence alone. Violet first survived Titanic as a stewardess and later boarded Titanic's sister ship because the same profession continued to shape her life. The second emergency unfolded very differently. On November 21st, 1916, an explosion in the Kia Channel caused Britannic to list rapidly while Captain Charles Alfred Bartlett attempted to bring the ship toward shallow water. Some portside lifeboats were lowered before the vessel had stopped, and while the propellers were still turning. According to Violet's memoir, the boat carrying her began moving toward the danger at the stern. She recognized that staying aboard could leave her with no safe escape and entered the water before the boat reached the propeller zone. She later recalled being drawn beneath the surface, striking her head, and eventually receiving assistance from others. The surviving documentation does not securely identify the person who recovered her, so that role cannot responsibly be assigned to a named rescuer. What can be established is that Violet acted before the danger became greater, endured the violent movement of the water, and was brought to safety while the wider evacuation continued. Titanic and Britannic were sister ships, but their losses were not repetitions of the same event. Titanic struck an iceberg during a peacetime passenger voyage in the North Atlantic and remained afloat for more than 2.5 hours. Britannic encountered what later historical consensus identifies as a German-laid mine while serving as a wartime hospital ship in the Aegean and sank in about 55 minutes. Their shared design makes the comparison compelling. While their different missions, damage, and evacuation conditions make each disaster historically distinct, the relationship among the three Olympic-class ships also corrects a common misconception. Violet did not survive 3 sinkings. RMS Olympic collided with HMS Hawk in 1911 but remained afloat, returned for repairs, and continued in service. It was her first major maritime emergency, not a third shipwreck. The vessels she survived losing were Titanic and Britannic. No supernatural explanation is required. Violet's training gave her a useful role when routine collapsed. Familiarity with shipboard discipline helped her respond to instructions. Officers, sailors, wireless operators, lifeboat crews, and rescuers created opportunities that she could not have created alone. Her judgment mattered most visibly aboard Britannic, but judgment still operated within circumstances shaped by timing and chance. She was neither invulnerable nor selected by fate. She was a capable working woman who twice reached the narrow point where professional experience, collective action, physical endurance, and opportunity were enough to keep her alive. Surviving Britannic did not end Violet Jessup's relationship with the sea. After the evacuation, she was brought safely ashore with the majority of those who had been aboard the hospital ship. The immediate work centered on accounting for survivors, providing assistance, and allowing exhausted crew members and medical personnel to recover from an emergency that had unfolded in less than an hour. The remarkably high survival rate reflected improved lifeboat capacity, organized action by officers and crew, and rapid help from nearby vessels, even though approximately 30 people lost their lives. Violet later described a more private consequence. In her memoir, she recalled suffering headaches for years before a medical examination revealed evidence of an old skull injury that she believed came from the Britannic evacuation. Reputable accounts present this as her later recollection rather than as a contemporary medical record, but it remains an important reminder that reaching shore did not necessarily end the physical effects of survival. Even after a second Olympic-class disaster, Violet continued in maritime service. She worked after the First World War with the White Star Line and other shipping companies as ocean travel passed through technological change, economic uncertainty, and another global conflict. New ships replaced the great Edwardian liners. Passenger expectations changed, and safety standards developed, but the essential demands of her profession remained recognizable. Long hours, close attention to passengers, orderly routines, and responsibility within a strict hierarchy. Her continued career matters because it prevents the disasters from consuming her entire identity. Violet Jessup was not only the woman who survived Titanic and Britannic. She was a maritime worker whose employment lasted for decades before and after the moments that made her famous. She retired from shipboard service in 1950, closing a career that stretched from the age of the great transatlantic liners into the post-war world. Documentation of her private retirement years is limited, and that silence should not be filled with invented conversations, hidden fears, or dramatic claims about how she interpreted her past. What survives supports a quieter conclusion. She lived away from regular service, preserved her memories, and eventually recorded experiences that official reports could never fully capture. Violet died in 1971 at the age of 83. Her memoir, written later in life and published after her death from the surviving manuscript, became an essential source for understanding the human experience aboard Titanic and Britannic. Like every eyewitness account recorded long after an event, it must be read with care. Memory can preserve details absent from official documents, especially the routines, impressions, and practical experiences of an individual worker, but it cannot provide complete knowledge of events occurring across an entire ship. Her account is therefore most valuable when read beside crew records, official inquiries, White Star Line documentation, archival materials, museum research, and reliable maritime scholarship. Together, those sources reveal something broader than one improbable survival story. The public image of Edwardian ocean travel was built around grand staircases, famous captains, wealthy passengers, and extraordinary engineering. Beneath that image stood an enormous labor force whose work usually became visible only when normal systems failed. Stewardesses prepared cabins, cared for women and children, answered calls, maintained order, and translated instructions into practical help. Engineers, firemen, cooks, cleaners, wireless operators, sailors, medical attendants, and nurses kept vast ships functioning through thousands of ordinary hours that history rarely records. Violet's perspective gives that hidden world a human face. During Titanic's evacuation, her value did not come from command authority, but from remaining useful within a structure under pressure. On Britannic, the same. Professional habits supported a different mission aboard a floating hospital during wartime. Captain Charles Alfred Bartlett represents another level of that collective response. From the bridge, he ordered emergency precautions, directed distress actions, attempted to bring the damaged ship toward Kia, and remained with his command while evacuation continued. His leadership influenced the outcome, but the survival of most aboard Britannic cannot be credited to one person. Officers interpreted reports, engineers worked below deck, medical staff managed patients, sailors handled boats, wireless operators summoned help, and rescuers completed the recovery. The disaster became survivable for so many because those separate responsibilities converged before the ship disappeared. Violet's place within this history should therefore remain remarkable without becoming mythical. She did not conquer the sea, and she was never safe simply because she had survived before. Titanic and Britannic placed her in two different emergencies linked by the same family of ships. In each, she depended upon the work of others as much as they depended upon disciplined individuals carrying out their own roles. She followed instructions when Titanic's familiar world collapsed, and she acted decisively when Britannic's lifeboat carried her toward a danger she could see approaching. Around those choices stood systems, leadership, rescue, endurance, and chance. The most enduring truth is not that Violet Jessop possessed an impossible gift for survival. It is that an ordinary working woman passed through two of the 20th century's defining maritime disasters, returned repeatedly to her profession, and left a record that allows later generations to see the great liners not only as ships, but as workplaces sustained by people whose quiet competence became most visible when everything else began to fail.